book talk. As we mentioned, the session will be recorded and put up on our YouTube channel, which is of really big importance for scholars, policymakers who are interested in ECPS events and our discussions. I hope you're all warm and toasty if you're in Europe, the Western Hemisphere. And if you're not, I envy you deeply. It's, I think, 2 degrees right now. My apartment is frigid. But it's fun to see some warm and familiar faces. So, one second. So today we'll be speaking about Dr. Liz Carmichael's book titled Peacemaking and Peacebuilding in South Africa, the National Peace Accord between 1991 and 1994. Please give me a brief moment to pull up the biographies, which I know vanished as I see guys. There we go. Awesome stuff. So about our author today, Dr. Liz Carmichael is an Emeritus Fellow from St. John's College, in Oxford. She was born in England, and Dr. Liz was a doctor at Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto between 1975 and 1981. She then studied theology at Oxford and worked in the Anglican Diocese of Johannesburg between 1991 and 1996, where she was ordained as a priest and served on peace committees under the National Peace Accord. She was a chaplain and tutor in theology at St. John's College between 1996 and 2011. Dr. Carmichael then held an Emeritus Research Fellowship between 2011 and 2023, which enabled her to write and research the groundbreaking book titled Peacemaking and Peacebuilding in South Africa, discussing the National Peace Accord between 1991 and 1994. Today we have 2 incredible discussants, the first being Dr. Henning Melber. Dr. Henning Melber came to Namibia as the son of a German immigrant in 1967, where he then joined the anti-colonial movement SWAPO in 1971. He was the director of the Namibian Economic Policy Research Unit in Windhoek, and the research director of the Nordic, and is currently the research director of the Nordic Africa Institute and director of the Dag, Hammarskjöld Foundation, both in Uppsala, Sweden. He is currently an extraordinary professor at the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria and the Center for Gender and Africa Studies at the University of Free State in Bloemfontein, as well as research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. Our second discussant is Dr. Palesa Nqambaza, who is a scholar specializing in gender studies, political theory, and African philosophy. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Political Sociology at the University of Witwatersrand and a visiting research fellow in the School of Philosophy, Religion, and History of Science at the University of Leeds. Dr. Nqambaza's research engages deeply with contemporary South African politics through cultural expressions, particularly the piano music genre, which she explores as a lens for understanding the social political perspectives of young South Africans post-1994. So, as mentioned, we have really insightful discussants, people who are familiar with the time period discussed with the Peace Accord, and people discussing youth politics now. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Carmichael to give us a quick discussion on the process behind the book and the general themes the book overviews before going to a few guided questions and have general discussion around. Dr. Carmichael.
Thanks very much, Neo, and hello, everybody. The reason why I wrote this book was that the subject is important and there was no book. So here is the book. Please do feel free to get it, and you can use a code to get it quite cheaply, which I'll tell you about at the end. So we're going back to the major part of the transition period in South Africa between apartheid and democracy. We're going to the period after Mandela has been released from prison, and at the same time, the liberation movements were unbanned. That was the ANC, the PAC, AZAPO, and other organizations and movements were all unbanned. And the expectation at that point was that the transition would then proceed fairly smoothly, but it didn't. And the response, as we'll see in a moment, was the National Peace Accord. That was the first response. So the National Peace Accord, signed on the 14th of September 1991, so already a year and a half after Mandela's release, is historic for at least 3 reasons. It was the first multiracial, multi-party consensus agreement in South Africa's whole history. And its signing opened the way for constitutional talks to open on the 20th of December. It created peace implementation structures on national, regional, and local levels. And this is where the people come in. We're talking about people and democracy. So people who had been denied democracy for 100 years and more, and well, different events happened before that, suddenly are invited in to the process of transforming their country together. So the peace implementation structures, the peace structures, formed a safety net that held firm and grew, mobilizing the people for peace up to and through the first democratic election on the 27th of April, on and around the 27th of April, of course, it took more days than just one, in 1994. So who are these people? If you sail down the west coast of Africa, you come to Table Mountain, which faces north. So we are sailing south into Table Bay. And if we go further south beyond Table Mountain, we're going to get to Antarctica. But to our left is the bulk of South Africa. The peoples of South Africa arrived at various times over the last couple of thousand years. And before that, the San, commonly known as the Bushmen, had occupied the whole area for at least 50,000 years. And before that, there were earlier sort of fossil humans. If you look to your left, therefore, going down towards Table Mountain, you're looking at South Africa, which in the figures in the early 90s housed almost 40 million people, 39.6 million, of whom 75% are Black African of various language groups. So 30 million Black African. 5 million white, again from various origins. 3.5 million colored, that is mixed race, and the word colored is still used. So 8% or 3.5 million colored, and 1 million Indian and other Asians. Quite a mixed population, of whom in 1990, only the whites had a meaningful vote. The colored and Indians had been given in the previous decade their own houses in Parliament, but without real power. The Black African groups, as I said, of different language groups, had been segregated under apartheid into little Bantustans. And here is the map of South Africa as we approach this, this transition. We have the very large Cape Province, historically mainly English-speaking since the British took over in 1814. We have Natal here, and I'll explain these shaded bits in a moment. They are the Bantustans, but this is one Bantustan in pieces. So Natal was a British colony, so sort of mainly English-speaking. And then the original republics of the Boers, the Afrikaner people, the Orange Free State, and Transvaal. After the South African War between the British Empire and the Afrikaner republics, after that had ended, in 1910, South Africa as we know it came into being, comprised of these 4 provinces. They were originally in colonies and republics. They became the provinces of the Union of South Africa in 1910. The Afrikaners had, shortly after that, created their own national party, which, after a complicated history, took over the government in the national election among whites and coloured voters as well in 1948 on a ticket which was a ticket of complete racial separation, apartheid. The popular vote, we're used to that now in the age of Trump, the popular vote actually kept the fairly liberal-ish Union Party in power. But the National Party had 5 more seats in Parliament and therefore took over and began to impose apartheid. And apartheid was a complete system of separation with the whites in power and arrangements which had to be obeyed for the rest of the population. So these shaded bits are 10 Bantustans, homelands for people of different language groups. For example, in Natal, all these little bits are parts of KwaZulu, the Zulu Bantustan or homeland. They exist in little bits because you've got white farmland and so on in between. So these bits are both rural and urban townships under the KwaZulu government. Then here you've got Transkei, Xhosa people, then Ciskei, again Xhosa, and then up here you've got Bophuthatswana in 6 or 7 different bits, and up here Venda at the top, and in between several other homelands. And at the height of apartheid, the policy of the apartheid government was that Black people would not any longer be able to have a family life in the whole of the rest of South Africa, white South Africa, but would be allowed in as workers. They would live in single sex, supposedly single, they were usually married, hostels around the towns, and be the servants of the whites. That was actually unworkable as well as being cruel. And during the 80s, apartheid began simply to crumble inside. And intelligent Afrikaners were writing books to explain how apartheid could not work and was anti-Christian. And the whole of South Africa was a Christian, vastly majority Christian country. The other the other churches, apart from the Afrikaner Dutch Reformed Church, had been pointing out the iniquities of apartheid, and eventually this got through into the intellectual Afrikanerdom, particularly through people at Stellenbosch University, for example, and those working in the Black Church as pastors. So by the 80s, this whole system was beginning to break down. It had caused various uprisings, famously the uprising of the school children in 1976 in Soweto. I was working as a doctor in Soweto at that time, so I saw that. And after 76, really, there was never a time when there wasn't at least unrest bubbling under the surface. And throughout the 80s, there was conflict between the white security forces, the police and army, and also the authorities in these little homelands and the people. So a state of conflict throughout South Africa existed. And these conflicts can more or less be broken down into two at the time of Mandela's release. The majority of the people against the apartheid government and its security forces, the police, which existed in various forms, including riot police and, of course, the security police, which had a dirty tricks unit, and the army, including military intelligence, which also had a dirty tricks unit. And by that I mean assassinations and disappearances. And there was a grassroots, low-intensity civil war beginning in the middle of the 80s in Natal, KwaZulu, between progressive ANC supporters and the ruling conservative Zulu cultural movement, which was in power in the legislature in KwaZulu, known as Inkatha and led by Chief Buthelezi. So an overall conflict and a specific low-intensity civil war. And I just put this in. This is rural KwaZulu. This is how the people were living all over the hills of KwaZulu-Natal. Very vulnerable. You can see that if you're a little unit which is out to shoot people and make trouble, you can very easily creep up to any of these little homesteads at night and simply shoot people. And groups of people from KwaZulu were actually trained by the army in what they euphemistically called house clearance. In other words, killing everybody in one of these little kraals. So Nelson Mandela was released, the liberation movements unbanned in February of 1990, and there were two expectations. There would be peace because Mandela would speak with Buthelezi, and they knew each other, they respected each other, they had been in contact with each other, but that didn't happen because hawks in the ANC refused to allow Mandela to meet Buthelezi for a whole year. And meanwhile, things became worse. So the other expectation was that multi-party constitutional talks would begin quite soon. And that didn't happen. Instead, you just had a rather desultory series of mainly security talks between the ANC and the government about topics like who is and is not a political prisoner and therefore must be released, and the safety of exiles coming back into the country, and the continuation or not of the armed struggle. So peace didn't happen, constitutional talks didn't happen. The violence, the civil war spread up to the townships around Johannesburg, coinciding with Inkatha, which had been a cultural movement, in theory, becoming the Inkatha Freedom Party and launching itself as an open political party. And the low-intensity civil war spreads up into the townships, and that this, I think, was taken in Alexandra Township, where I later served on the Peace Committee, and this was the scene before the Peace Committee was formed. So no sign of multi-party constitutional talks. And there's a crisis as this violence persists and the government and ANC talks stall, and the crisis comes in April 1991. Now, at that point, a remarkable group of church and business leaders got together. I tell in my book how they had organized themselves to play a progressive role in the transition. And at this point, they come together and form this 12-strong group of facilitators. They managed to get themselves into the political process with the quite keen backing of the ANC, the gratitude of the government, and very reluctant support from Buthelezi, who didn't trust anybody. So here we've got church leader Johan Haynes from inside the Dutch Reformed Church, known and trusted by the government, and Lo Alberts, who was a lay person, a physicist, government scientific advisor, also trusted by the government. John Hall from the Barlow Rand Corporation, Frank Chikane, General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches, Bobby Godsall from Anglo-American, Jabu Mabuza, Black Business, Kotso Mngorja, the President of the South African Council of Churches, Ray Macaulay from the charismatic Rhema Church, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Gerry Lipper, who is churches and represents the interfaith community, Sean Cleary, a ex-diplomat turned mediator working with business, and Sam Motswanyane, Black Business again. And at Barlow Park, headquarters of the Barlow Rand conglomerate, on the 22nd of June 1991, these people, with all their contacts, managed to get all the political leaders who matter together. At least not the actual top leaders, but they were asked to send lieutenants who would begin to do the work on organizing peace agreements. And that's what happened. From between June and September, this National Peace Accord, a little booklet of 33 pages, was drawn up. It includes, first of all, the statement that the establishment of a multi-party democracy in South Africa is our common goal. That's the first time it was put in writing. It's got a code of conduct for political parties, saying things like, we will not kill our opponents, we will not tear down their posters, we will not prevent them going to meetings, and so on. Just 2 pages of immense importance. Then general provisions and a code of conduct for security forces, moving the police and also the army, when they're in support of the police, towards a philosophy of community policing and away from the old colonial type of policing, repressive policing. And the police were pretty good on the whole at honouring this, and the peace committees were there to help them do so. And then a very seminal little chapter on how to facilitate socioeconomic reconstruction and development, which fed into the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Programme, which was the manifesto of the ANC for the 1994 election, and which sadly was stymied by Thabo Mbeki then cancelling the RDP programmes and putting a macroeconomic trickle-down process which doesn't trickle down in place. And then the structures, there's the Commission of Inquiry, which was the Goldstone Commission, headed by Judge Richard Goldstone. Very important, working with the peace committees. Then the National Peace Secretariat, which serviced the peace committees, 11 regions, and in the end, 263 local peace committees, originally called dispute resolution committees, but renamed in 1993, all those peace committees. And a national peace committee at the top. And how you enforce the peace agreement was mainly by shaming those who were breaking the agreement. So this is 14th of September 1991. F.W. de Klerk being greeted at the beginning of the signing ceremony, which took a whole day, by Desmond Tutu. Here is Kobe Coetzee, who took part in secret talks with Mandela in prison. That's just part of the scene as 400 delegates gather for the National Peace Convention. And the signatories were everybody from the middle outwards. They did not include the extreme white right or the extreme left black. But the black organizations, as ARPO, POC, did attend and said they were for peace, but they would not sign anything that the apartheid government signed, because that would be to give them recognition. And this is the only time that these three sat in a line and laughed together, and I'm sure it's because they're laughing at Desmond Tutu's funny story, which he told at the end of the proceedings before saying a prayer. So F.W. de Klerk, Nelson Mandela, Chief Buthelezi. This is a simple diagram of the peace structures. At the top, at national level, you've got the National Peace Committee, entirely political representatives, but chaired by the businessman John Hall and co-chaired by the Methodist Bishop Stanley Mkhoba. Then regional peace committees, there were 11, and in the end 263 local peace committees. And it's a trickle-down process, convening meetings at the lower level. So the National Peace Secretariat convenes people in each region, sets up a regional peace committee very quickly, and then that regional peace committee can set up as many local peace committees as are needed. And the people who serve on the regional and local peace committees include civil society, business and churches and community groups, as well as the security forces, all the kinds of police that are operating in that region, and the army. And the local peace committees also have the same mix: civil society, politicians, and security forces. So quite comprehensive. And that's just to show all the subcommittees and other things that developed. And this shows the 11 regions. They more or less map onto the new provinces, 9 provinces of present-day South Africa. So Western Cape region, Northern Cape, and so on. This is a typical local peace committee having a weekend away. It's not the whole committee, but it's most of them. And we've got represented the ANC, the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, the army, police, business, churches, displaced people from the violence, and people from the apartheid hostels, which had become fortresses mainly for Zulus who had been attacked as being Zulu and therefore IFP spies and so on. It's all quite complicated. Anyway, here we are. This committee has been in existence since April of 1992. It's now September. and business pays for this weekend away to look at a vision for the future for Alex. That's Alexandra Township in the northeast suburbs of Johannesburg. How did we get a grip on the violence? We went to every incident. We found out what apparently had really happened. We found out what people thought had happened and how they were going to organize to retaliate. And we would try to organize a more constructive way of responding to the violence, and it worked. By Christmas 1992, this is a Christmas party with the army commander in the middle, very good chap. The elderly IFP leader in the township and the ANC representative. And here we've got the whole staff of the Free State, which was a marvelously well-organized region. It's one of the sub-regional teams, Southern Free State. Right from the beginning, there was a publicity campaign. That's the one thing that the government really had money for. Eventually, there was money for other things, but we started simply on a shoestring. However, these adverts came out over Christmas 1991, and that one with the two fists, first of all pointing each other and then clasping each other, was quite a hit. And then in 93, we had the peace doves, and everybody wanted the T-shirt. It was the logo of the peace structures on monitors' jackets and so on. That's a first outing for the peace doves on the street, keeping IFP and ANC rally goers apart. This is an ANC rally. And we got international observers from the UN, the Commonwealth, these are Commonwealth people, the African OAU, as it was then, and the European Union all sent observers to serve with the peace committees and as trainers and so on. This is Peace Day in September 1993. It was a dummy run for the whole election period. The whole country got involved in Peace Day. At noon, all the TV and radio stations played the peace song. And this is after months of fighting in the East Rand townships, especially Thokoza, Katlehong. These are the originally riot police, now called the Internal Stability Unit. Peace monitors setting out on a peace walk. This is all Peace Day. Again, a very disturbed part of southern KwaZulu-Natal. But those who've been fighting now playing soccer. This is Bloemfontein, the capital of the Free State. Bloemfontein for peace. Miss South Africa for peace. One of the textile workers who worked overtime for free to produce 1.5 million more peace T-shirts for New Year 1994. And peace is cool. The typical monitor team. The monitor with the crowd. Peace Day, Methodist Bishop Peter Story and 2 local peace monitors in Soweto over the election period, 18,500 local peace monitors were fielded. And that's it. Except I could, if I can get to my screen again, I could play a 1-minute clip of the peace song, but I think that's enough for the moment.
Thank you, Dr. Carmichael, for the presentation. While you went through the slides, you get a sense of how expansive the issue was of violent conflict, but also how far the parties involved went to not only come to the negotiation table, but to make it a reality. The book itself is definitely a treasure trove of really small, fascinating information. As a young South African, reading the book gave me more insight to what actually transpired to get here. It's a part of our history that I think is overlooked and isn't gone into enough detail. But to start off our discussion, I wanted to highlight that as you go in the book and as you read, you realize of how massive of a crisis the virus was perceived to be, not just by people experiencing it, but by, churches, organizations, and government. And it seems like we've moved to a world, or rather the world right now is in a similar place of crisis. There is an uptake in, intercommunal violence, sporadic wars, and what people can consider to be large space discontent politically, economically. But it seems governments, not just Africa, but abroad, have a hesitance to respond with the same scale or intensity in trying to fix these issues or trying to re-solidify, recodify society as a whole. And so my question to not just you, Dr. Carmichael, but to all our discussants to kick it off is there not enough of a crisis globally to facilitate, governmental discussions? And how can we get to a place where we begin to really reactivate society to take part at a top-down, down-up level? Any of our speakers, Dr. Carmichael, Dr. Melber, or Dr. Nqambaza, whoever feels more comfortable speaking, it's up to you.
Can I just mention the idea of the national dialogue, which has come up recently, and there's a committee formed by the various foundations which try to keep alive the legacy of Mandela, the Tambos, the Tutus, and Chief Lutuli, and Steve Biko, and in fact all the foundations have formed a committee to try to promote the idea of a national dialogue. And those looking at the ideas for it all remark how uncannily they are like the peace structures, which unfortunately were dismantled at the end of 1994, just when a lot of us hoped they would be used for really grassroots reconstruction and development. But it will take quite a lot of resources to put a national dialogue together in a meaningful way. But it's great to see that idea being canvassed and explored.
Yeah, what you mentioned is the sense of the dismantling of the structures a bit too soon. That there was this almost, this rush to get past transition and into a place of, normality. And the structures amongst things like, the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, give this sense of things still being fixed. And it might have been felt by the state, other stakeholders that, having these structures still, erected might do more harm than good in portraying a unified, healed South Africa, or a South Africa that is, fully ready to interact with the world. And so it is, I agree, interesting to see that there is a regression, or going back to this realization that there needs to be continuous consultation, and that there needs to be this, widespread, um, um, multi-reaching structures that start at the grassroots, but really make their way to government, instead of just, regional committees that, don't have any real power, or a government that is unresponsive.
Yeah, or just have one meeting and then it all collapses.
Definitely. But within light of this, I think it's important to speak about how that time was a time of transition, right? And Southern Africa as a region has been going through massive transition. Dr. Melber is familiar with Namibian politics and the SADC region. I think we all are. And we're seeing how liberation movements are not only losing power, but there's this reconfiguration, right, of political authority, and an almost returning to the need to really involve people, in order to create a more vibrant, strengthened society. But I am curious to ask, in how would the SADC region, the regional SADC, or the individual states interact with each other? But how can they face their collective history? As the book tries to point out that peace came by this brutal facing of history. Dr. Melber wrote a book a while ago, recently published, speaking about the facing of Namibia's colonization and how that is required for there to be an advancing of the state. And SADC, due to its political history, seems to have this difficulty in really facing and overcoming its past politically. And that difficulty is not just seen in SADC, but the entire continent as a whole. So, Dr. Melba, I'm interested to ask, how would you approach, or how do you see the region really facing its past? And how has this, until now, this limited interaction with, coming to terms with what really happened, how has it fared for us as a region, as individual countries?
Thank you, Neo. And with your permission and the permission of others, good evening to all of you. I would like to start with a different perspective to be added before I come to your question. But let me first thank Liz for the presentation, but even more so, Liz, for your personal engagement in that process, which you summarized and presented, because you highlight a very important aspect which we tend to overlook when we analyze. We look at structures and shifts, but fundamentally, the insight is people do matter. Mm. You need people to reconcile, you need people to form a common basis, you need people who are willing to compromise for the sake of a better future. And I think that is one of the lessons, not only, but also from the transitions in South Africa. Mm. But before coming to Neo's question, I would actually put it into a wider context, because domestic policy and dynamics is important, but they are not the whole story. That apartheid became obsolete and anachronistic was a result of geostrategic appeasement. You could already read the signs at the wall in the 1970s and 1980s from the point of view of the interest of private capital, apartheid became a straitjacket. Sanctions kicked in, strikes were on the increase, civil protests were on the rise. So basically, it spoiled the business. So that was one of the aspects. The other aspect was glasnost and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which actually led to geostrategic appeasements. Russia withdraws from Afghanistan, Cuba withdraws from Angola, paving the way for a United Nations supervised election in Namibia, which then, as a result, led to independence on 21st March 1990. And coming from Namibia, I always proudly claim we were the ones who paved the way for the end of apartheid in South Africa, because we were the litmus test. While initially the Lancaster House Agreement was the first of the type, which then collapsed, we were the ones in the wider picture of the geostrategic appeasement to say, if controlled change in Namibia works, then there is no reason not to try the same in South Africa. And we were very well aware in 1990, if we don't make it work, the South Africans would be within 2 hours in Namibia and drop their bombs from their jets. So that was not necessarily entirely voluntarily, but it was a negotiated deal. The former liberation movement compromised into a constitution which basically protected the status quo in terms of the economic structures and the property relation. And it indeed worked. I remember Nelson Mandela and de Klerk were the ones who attended the independence ceremony in Windhoek on 21st March 1990. And when Mandela entered the stadium, which now has the name Independence Stadium, he was welcomed with more applause than the future president of Namibia, Sam Nujoma, who was sworn in at midnight. He was the ultimate iconic hero just a few weeks after his release from Robben Island. So that was the overall context. And there was another dynamic which kind of prepared the ground. It started with Dakar in 1987, when the liberal whites like Van Zyl-Slabbert and others were meeting with the ANC, which was basically leaving behind an absolute taboo. It subsequently resulted in the establishment of CISA, the Zimbabwe Institute for Southern Africa in Harare, where you had these important meetings between liberal whites from South Africa and members of the ANC, especially people like Thabo Mbeki, who already anticipated what if and how can we bring it about. So while this does not reduce anything of the merits of the process you illustrate, my intention was just to put it in a wider context to better understand why at the end of the day, despite all the atrocious violence and the tremendous human costs, by the mid-1990s, a transition was implemented, paving the way for democratic elections and a government which survived since then. Important in that aspect was also that the role Inkatha and Buthelezi played in adding to the violence made its supporters in Western Europe and especially in Germany think twice if this is the solution to South Africa. They were not interested in a civil war-like chronic situation. So Inkatha and Buthelezi realized they are losing support if they continue to engage in this brutal violence with the ANC. Okay, I leave it there. It was just my intention to put it into that overall context. Now, Neo, coming to your question. In all these cases where former liberation movements seized political power in a more or less legitimate way based on elections, from the point of view of the liberation movements, this was the end of history. Meaning they are ruling, please bear with me if I use it because it's what those leaders say, until the day when Jesus comes back. That is exactly what they repeat to say until the very day. It was said in Namibia 2 weeks ago. So the perception was end of history, meaning we are in political power and will never, ever give away political power, which is a message which is quite contrasting to the claim that this is democracy, the rule of law, and a constitutional state. Because then you should not make such a statement. But that replicated and reproduced the mindset of those who had seized power, who came from a setup based on underground work, on military resistance, which created authoritarian mindsets with an extremely internalized we-they divide, meaning if you are not with us, you are against us. And it was Nelson Mandela in an interview after he was president who said, it's the wrong equation. It should say, if you are not against us, you are with us. And he said, we lack the tolerance, we lack the ability to accommodate dissenting views. That is the burden of history of an anti-colonial struggle based on violence, on underground, which is guided by mistrust, where you have to do clandestine organizations, where you don't even know who is the friend and who is the foe, where you operate anonymously and you do not trust anyone. That is a toxic atmosphere to build a plural society based on trust and the ability to cooperate. And it came like a gift from heaven when in May of this year, the ANC lost the absolute majority and was, as the first liberation movement in that situation, willing to accept relative defeat. It's a unique case. I'm not aware of any one of those. In Mozambique, when we look now into the neighboring state, Frelimo risks a civil war because they are not willing to surrender absolute political power. That is the challenge for the elections now in Namibia. Botswana was another lesson, despite the fact that it was not a proper liberation movement in the sense of the ANC, which seized in the mid-1960s power. It was legitimate, democratic. But the elections in Botswana and the smooth transition to a change in government for the first time since independence was another positive example. And just now, last week, we could witness in Mauritius a similar example. So sorry, Neo, I'm getting carried away. The point is the challenges we are facing is that there's an expiry date of the veterans in the liberation struggle. And we have to work hard that those who follow them are more open-minded to accept that a former liberation movement has also to transform. They speak about transformation of society. They need to speak about transformation of the former liberation movement into a party, into one party in a multi-party democracy where political contestation goes hand in hand with political collaboration depending on the election results. And I think that is a huge challenge. And my hope is that South Africa sets an example when it comes to that, and hope dies last.
Thank you, Dr. Melber. You really went off topic. I think you brought in a lot of salient points in regard to, the region's history and how it's informed its political culture, right? One that's, been marred political violence, and one that really hasn't found a way to detach that political violent history from its current politics. And I would really love to bring Dr. Nqambaza into the mix here. Now, when we speak about political culture that's based on violence, there are a lot of political movements in Southern Africa that really idealize its, liberation past, and it almost sustains the culture, right? Where new movements replicate the idea of being liberators, or they replicate political thought processes or political cultures from, liberation times. And I'm interested to see that, how we begin to try and reimagine, like Dr. Melber said, try and reimagine the continent's or region's political past into one that is, not detached of its past, but that, has come to terms with it and is looking past this need for exalting the struggle, but also one where we have, new leaders. Earlier, we heard that how big names like Dambo or Futa Genyu or Osubukwe are being revived to try, say that these are people that brought us here, but we don't have any new big name leaders that, when they're mentioned, invoke this feeling of unity, invoke this feeling of, statesmen that are looking for a bigger idea. So I'm interested, Dr. Nqambaza, how do we, renegotiate our politics as young people in popular culture that, decenters violence, that decenters, struggling heroes, and finds a way to reinvigorate a peace-based, consensus-based, transformative politics that can really be used to take our countries forward.
Thank you, Nell, for that question. And thank you. I'll start with Dr. Liz Carmichael for a book that I must admit has been giving me like a few sleepless nights, a few nightmares, because I was born in 1990. So you can imagine that when this transition period happened, I was not old enough to sort of understand what's happening at the time, the sort of politics, right, that were playing out with these processes. And reading this book, in many ways, it felt as if I was there, right, in real time, living through the transition period that led to the National Peace Accord. So, yeah, thank you for this contribution that's very detailed and definitely is one of those books that I believe you don't read once. You have to like sort of revisit because it's so dense with so much information that could actually be unpacked into multiple other books, right? There's just so many aspects. I think now how I answer your book really will be like a bit of a segue, because reading the book, but also just listening to this discussion, there's just a whole lot of things that are going on in my mind. So to begin with, I think I'll just start here to say, as much as I found Dr. Liz's book so informative, I did sort of get a sense that, and now this is me speaking in hindsight, right? So if Dr. Robert Sobukwe once upon a time is said to have asked the sort of question that says, Asazi iyo zalengo monina, right? Like these sort of politics in South Africa, we wonder what they will birth. I think in 2024, we have a good idea of, what the transition period and those sort of politics have birthed, the sort of South Africa that we live through today. But also I was just thinking that Dr. Liz Carmichael does write this book in the context where Marikana has happened. I'm not sure exactly when the writing started. I know that it was published in 2022, but this is also in a context where the Rhodes Must Fall movement has happened and Fees Must Fall movement has happened, right? And within all these contexts, we know that we see a resuscitation of the sort of politics of the Azanian movement, right? So the kind of politics that in the book are sort of characterized as like ultra left are what we hearing, right, in these Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, and even today, some of these political parties in their populist rhetoric, we see a sort of resurgence of those politics that are questioning politics around title to South Africa, politics that are critical even of the transition period, right? Saying that it seems as if the transition was more about extending the vote to Black South Africans, but it seems that question around a genuine decolonization of South Africa and returning title of the land to the people were never, right, sort of on the cards. And these are some of the things that still linger today. If you listen to a lot of political commentary, those themes keep coming up and up again. So then in many ways, it brings us back to the question of during transition, then how did we think about peace? What constitutes peace? And do South Africans, especially young South Africans living in the post-apartheid period, do we recognize the sort of existence as peaceful, right? I was sort of struck by how Dr. Liz Carmichael talks about during that transition period, peace was translated as kagiso, right? Kagiso. And I was just thinking that's pretty interesting. And she did the work of translating that. Actually, kagiso does sort of evoke the, I mean, if you translate it, it speaks to build. So it's this active process that requires that there's different stakeholders and multiple players that build this thing called kagiso, right? Peace. But I was thinking actually that as a Setswana speaker, and I did consult with my other friends who are Setswana speakers, the first word that comes to mind actually when we think of peace in Setswana is kgotso, right? And I started wondering that in that sense, you know, it does have a linguistic relationship to another word in Setswana that is kgotsi. So when you've eaten to your satisfaction, when you're content after eating, you know, you'll hear a child who ever say, I can't have much because ke kgotsi, right? There's a relationship between that kgotso and ke kgotsi. And I think this speaks to the question of economics, that definitely we cannot speak about peace when the question of economics is not addressed. And actually, this is an aspect that is plaguing, once again, post-1994 South Africa, with people asking that, okay, fine, we can vote, good and well, but where is the economic dividend of living in this peaceful post-apartheid South Africa? And I think it is this increased inequality that we witness today that's making so many people, especially young people, question, you know, the transition and the sort of concessions that happened during that period to say, actually, we're not witnessing the sort of freedom that comes with being economically free. Where's the peace that comes? And of course, then, and this also has ramifications for actual peace living in townships, where we know that for those of us that can't afford to live in gated communities, crime is rampant. So perhaps it's not necessarily political violence that we're living through today, but definitely it's a very violent, unsafe South Africa for a vast majority of people that don't live in gated communities, can't afford private security. So I think, I don't want to go on and on, but I think definitely these are some of the issues that cause the sort of suspicion that we have, especially among young people, about that sort of transition period and the sort of concessions that were made.
Yeah, hey, thank you for that, Dr. Nqambaza. As you're speaking, I just have one more question. Dr. Carmichael, do you have your hand up? Or was I? Oh, yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Sorry, hello. Yes, I just wanted to go back to something I said at the end of my presentation, which was about the failure to carry through on the socioeconomic reconstruction and development side of the peace committees, which had begun to be quite strong. It took some time, but some pretty good consultants and grassroots people had been recruited into that side of the peace committees by the time that they were dismantled. And I mentioned the RDP, which actually should have had more of a connection with grassroots communities than it did. But the original idea of it was that it would involve people at grassroots in their own development. And that is what has been missing. The peace committees had really created a considerable amount of social cohesion and of momentum of people getting together in localities and doing what was necessary in that locality. So if national dialogue can bring back something of that cohesion and freedom to get together and see what actually needs doing, then that may be a bit of an answer to poverty. But it's a tough one.
Sorry, Neil, I don't mean to jump in, but I'm just thinking about what Rev. Dr. Carmichael just said about, you know, once again, the role of dialogue, right? That if we get people from the grassroots to be once again active participants in sort of carving the sort of South Africa they want to see, it would help a lot. And I take that. But I must say, also reading the book and bearing in mind the sort of background that Dr. Melber gave us, I did also get a sense that during the transition period, the perimeters were pretty much set in terms of, what the compromise would be and the sort of South Africa that would sort of result from the sort of negotiation. I got that sense. I got a sense that, especially because we see, to begin with, the role of business in sort of pushing for this, that, capitalism was definitely going to be on the cards, right? It was going to come out on top. I don't think that the perimeters of the negotiations were so radical to say, actually, let's let go of this, let's have a socialist or a communist state. I really question if that sort of radicality was on the cards to begin with. And then it makes me wonder, when we look at the GNU now, the sort of pressure that we see, there's a lot of rumors, but also there is a video that's out with Helen Zille that says that going into the election, they had pressure from business that sort of said, stop an ANC-MK coalition, right? We need to see the sort of government that comes out to be like a sort of ANC-DA coalition. We can't afford to have those radical left voices come be sort of in coalition with the ANC. So it sounds like even today, that capitalist business voice is still pretty much strong in sort of setting the perimeters of how South African politics will play out. And it makes me then a bit skeptical or wonder if then really the voice of the people, does it have a sort of platform where it can be taken so seriously that it can continue or influence policy to that degree?
Wow, these are fantastic. Dr. Melber?
Thanks. I tried to be quick, but that is what I meant with reference to controlled change. And you picked it up, Palesa. The transformation was one in terms of a constitution, democracy, civil rights, fantastic, rule of law. But you left the structural legacy of a white minority regime and the ownership that went hand in hand with it untouched. And then the fundamental flaw was, and that applies not only to South Africa, it also applies to the other former liberation movements as governments, that this was translated into a pact among elites. The old elite could afford to tolerate a new elite, which is now the main beneficiary of the new democratic society. In South Africa, it took less than 10 years until the word state capture became the motto of the day. So those who entered the commanding heights of government and state, especially the state-owned enterprises with the appropriation of taxpayers' money, abuse of tenders, they were the ones who were the main beneficiaries. But while we are talking, South Africa and Namibia remain the most unequal societies in the world in terms of the skewed income distribution. Meaning, from a perspective of the majority of the people, in their daily struggle for survival, hardly anything has changed. You had a limited black middle class, which was also a beneficiary, moving into the upper echelons of state administration, also private companies, because they can't be run only by whites only any longer. But they are still in a very fragile situation. So this is not a fundamental transformation of society. And George Orwell sends greetings. All animals are created equal. Some animals are created more equal than others. And if you live in a township or in the rural countryside, in informal shacks, that is the daily experience. And this is where the expiry date of movements as governments has come, because they did not deliver in terms of good governance.
Thank you, Dr. Melber. We're slowly moving towards the end here. We have a few comments in the chat box. I just want to abuse my role as facilitator to have two quick inputs before we wrap up. I think one is informed by a comment by William Ellis, who mentions that academics need to contribute more on the debate, and that what's happening globally, we can learn from other countries. And I think it's really, really important. South Africa is moving towards a politics that's going to be underpinned by power sharing. And that's a new politics for us in the region. And the continent is slowly following suit. But we've seen from other countries that power sharing, one, is difficult to do if you have parties that are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. But two, the issue of compromise can either make or break a functional government. Germany, as many of you may know, was entering snap elections, I believe, next week, because their government just fell through, where they failed to compromise on policy issues. And as it stands right now, South Africa's GNU does not seem to be faring much better amongst in-house disputes between the DA, the ANC, and other parties. But I'm curious, just one general question. What we feel the new parameters of the GNU may be, or the new parameters of this power-sharing democracy are, and the role populism plays in inflating these new parameters, right? Because populism isn't just, a disruptive force. It's also a force that, reintroduces marginalized voices into a politics that they feel has excluded them. And the GNU as it stands now has the capacity to truly reach as many South Africans as realistically possible. But there needs to be new parameters. So just a general question, then I'll have one question from the chat. But definitely, while I deal with that, can you just think about what are the new parameters the GNU has in spite of everything that's going on. We have a question by Ciro Bloom that asks that according to the understanding of Native South Africans, was peace and liberation achieved? And has the absence of government and capitalism made the negatively affected population of South Africa more free? Finally, what developments went wrong and what we recommended as a way of facing the new challenges just after the end of the 1990s? So those are three general questions up for grabs, and then we will wrap up. If possible, I can answer one. When you speak about the understanding of Native South Africans and peace and liberation, it comes down to one, who you consider to be native, which is a very hot topic in South African politics right now. Who are the natives in South Africa? And what you mean by peace and liberation. I highlighted a section in Dr. Carmichael's book, where she wrote that peace in South Africa was to be by consensus, mean a progressive, multiparty, liberal democracy. So that meaning of a progressive, multi-party, and liberal democracy in that context was peace in South Africa, right? But it's possible that that definition of peace has now shifted. And so when you ask, was peace and liberation achieved, we need to define what we mean by peace. Because at the time, we achieved peace. We achieved liberal, multi-party, and democracy. So by those three statements, we have peace, Cedar Bloom. Liberation, it also depends on who you mean or what you mean by liberation. These phrases mutate or change over time. I don't believe there's one set answer. Definitely. What developments went wrong and what we recommended, I can't answer that. I believe one of our panelists might be able to. It's wow. I understand. I understand. Ladies and gentlemen, we have not much time and we have many, many questions. So I'm just going to read one or two more questions from the chat. And if anyone feels like answering, they may. If not, please, it's not that the panelists don't have anything to say, but they might have too much to say and they're aware of our time constraints. So another question is from Guillaume Bebe, who answers, what weight does the idea of peaceful transition hold when the transition was marked by violence despite the peace accord? And in that case, does peace not rather refer to stability for the sake of a liberal market democracy? If excess death and deprivatization rates in Black life continue to mark Black life and merciful war rates, what health continuity is despite the transition discourse? That's an amazing question. And the last question I'll take is by David Bremer, who mentioned that these aren't just new parameters, but they are new paradigms. If power politics or real politics are the global paradigm, it is in any case a failed paradigm from the perspective of protecting human rights, satisfying human needs, or resolving deep-rooted conflicts, and he refers to Israel, Palestine, China, and Tibet. So yeah, any other questions? Just one more from any of the panelists. If not, that's okay. I see that we find agreement in the chat, which I think is brilliant. That's the point of these discussions. But to our doctors, do any of the questions spark any insights, any last words before we sign off?
I think perhaps I just want to sort of speak back to the point that Dr. Gimbebe makes in the chat about what weight does the idea of peaceful transition hold when transition was marked by violence despite the peace accord, right? So I think in the book, this is something that Dr. Carmichael sort of addresses, that on the one hand, yes, the violence continued. And I was actually like struck by the statistic, I think if I remember from the top of my head, that said that from the time of the transition till around 1994, there were 15,000 political deaths that resulted during this period. And these are really alarming numbers. Then the number was even higher when it sort of started being accounted for in 1960. It went up to 20,000. And these were only deaths that were sort of recognized as political deaths that result from political violence. So, of course, there was a lot of violence that happened during that period. But then the sort of rejoinder was that in the absence of these peace committees and the peace accord, the death toll would have been way higher, right? And I want to say that, okay, granted, perhaps let's say that we sort of accept that sort of reading of this transition period. I think there's also something to be said about that what happened with the peace accord, and I think this is something once again that we see in the book, is that first step of peacemaking, right? No matter how questionable the quality of the peace is, right? We have that first level of the peacemaking, but it seems that then the component of peace building that speaks to the work that's supposed to happen now post 1994 into the new South Africa is something that failed dismally. And I even wonder if there was even the sort of political will to sort of go back and then build on the sort of peace that was made during the transition period. Because if I look back right now, a lot is left to be desired, right? Because I think even with the xenophobic attacks that we witnessed in 2008, 2010, 2000, all of this just speak to a South Africa that's in many ways imploding on itself. The violence that we witness today, the question of the zamazamas and the sort of right violence that's being meted in townships, all this chaos in many ways cannot be divorced from what happens during the transition period, especially when it comes to the issue of economics and how then that plays out in contemporary South Africa.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're reaching the very end of the book talk. Oh, Dr. Carmichael?
Okay, yes. Well, just a note again, the peace accord didn't entirely stop all the violence, but it did confine it. The statistics in the final year almost all relate to parts of KwaZulu-Natal where the violence was particularly deeply rooted and difficult to stop, and got muddled up with old feuds and so on. And the East Rand, which was a particular area that was very difficult. Yeah, I don't know if those of you who know it, it was originally an airfield. It's a very large flat area comprising 3 townships, Thokoza, Katlehong and Vosloorus. And mistakes were made there, and organizing for violence went on there, which resulted in a whole lot of deaths in 1993 to 4. So only those 2 areas really remained recalcitrant. In many other places that had been violent, such as Alexandra and Soweto, peace was in fact achieved. So,
okay. Thank you, everyone. The topic of peace seems to be, I think, at the very top of priority for everybody. The ways we achieve peace, how we get there, and what peace means to us. And I think overall, we are aware that peace, isn't just the absence of war physically, but if there are civil war-like statistics, if there's, instability, high crime rates, we then question if peace exists. I just want to ask Dr. Carmichael to tell us briefly about Ox Peace, and if there are any events to look forward to that we would like to join with. So if there's anything in mind about Ox Peace, please let us know.
Sorry. Well, we recently had a very interesting talk by Pierre Hazan, who has written a book about the whole international scene of mediation and how difficult it becomes when mediators are told they can't talk to terrorists. So it's a book called Negotiating with the Devil Inside the World of Armed Conflict Mediation. That was a meeting that went extremely well. I'm sorry it's not recorded, but you can get the book, Pierre Hazan. And we'll be doing a intensive training at the end, towards the end of March, 20th to 21st of March. You can get the details from Sumay. It's an intensive 2 days on dealing with difficult people in the context of international and also local conflict resolution. And then we'll be looking at women, peace and security again in May for the one-day conference that we have in Oxford in May. So those are the things I know about at the moment. Thanks very much, Neo. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carmichael. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Carmichael, again for, first of all, writing this book. Thank you for Discussants, Dr. Melber, Dr. Nqambaza, and all of our brilliant participants. The comments, chats, please follow us on our socials at Public Studies on Twitter. We can talk more about this offline. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all soon. Good night.